Moving on swiftly to the other article that continues and delves even deeper into the conspiratorial history of modernity, we jump right in and decipher the hidden origins of our world order and what may be coming next. So, who are the Illuminati? I want to shed some light into this. So, we're starting lightheartedly with this Pepe meme of the all-seeing eye, the pyramid. It's become a meme. Concealed within his fortress, the Lord of Mordor sees all. His gaze pierces cloud, shadow, earth, and flesh. You know of what I speak, a great eye, lidless, wreathed in flame. The Illuminati have almost become a meme, a joke about conspiracy theories and hidden manipulation. Everybody has chuckled at the idea of the pyramid with the all-seeing eye. It has something epic and fantastical to it, similar to the Eye of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. The Illuminati is said to be working towards a new world order or new secular order, Novus Ordo Seclorum, as seen on the Great Seal of the United States. Something that was announced on the Great Seal. Nonetheless, George Washington famously despised the Illuminati and wanted to stop them from entering the country. I've got a picture of the letter here, where he says, "I've heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, but never saw the book until you were pleased to send it to me." So there was an actual scare about them that even captured George Washington. The actual Bavarian Order of the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, is a rather opaque group, as the order officially did not last long before it was banned in 1787 by the authorities. Weishaupt was a former Jesuit who later became a staunch proponent of the Enlightenment. He was most influenced by Immanuel Kant, but he named his magnum opus after Pythagoras. His overall ideology and strategy for the Illuminati is laid out in his work, Pythagoras on the Secret Art of World and Government. Surprisingly, this work has not been translated into English and can only be found in the borderline unreadable Fraktur font in German. In the following, you will have the pleasure to read some excerpts that I translated myself. So here you see the original title. There's not many physical copies of this. I couldn't get one. I could only get the PDF. I think you can find them in the Bavarian State Library in Munich, or maybe also in Ingolstadt. German title is Pythagoras oder Betrachtungen über die geheime Welt- und Regierungskunst von Adam Weishaupt. So there's two titles. One is Pythagoras, or Observations about the Secret World and Government, Art of World and Government. So it's inspired by Pythagoras, the ancient philosopher, the one who potentially coined the term philosopher, who had two personalities, which led historians to believe that maybe they were two people with the same name, Pythagoras of Samos. So one of them was the mathematician, the one of the famous Pythagorean theorem, the one who worshipped number. And the other one was the shaman, the one who studied in Egypt, got introduced into the mysteries, who ran basically a school like a cult, and strove to increase his political influence, something that would have an impact on Plato later on and his ideas about the ideal state. Here the quote by Weishaupt: "I examine the conduct with which these relations necessarily produce. From this arises what I call the I, inner politics, a secret association in the strictest sense. I call that whose origin, purpose, means, organization, and existence are known only to its initiates, and insofar as some of these aspects concern their full extent, only to the most tested among its members. I cannot deny that an association of this kind must possess a great attraction for all who take part in it, and if secrecy is essential to a secret association for the attainment of its purposes, then this kind of association will achieve its purposes more reliably than any other. It will have the greatest incentive from within and the fewest obstacles from without." So it was a practical consideration in a way, because a lot of Enlightenment and revolutionary movements at the time were under heavy restriction or outright persecuted by the authorities. Weishaupt studied at a Jesuit university in Ingolstadt, after which he came to reject church authority as well as monarchy. In today's terms, he can be called a political radical, someone that was in favor of overthrowing the political order and establishing a new kind of utopia. These were common ideas in the build-up to the French Revolution. Rousseau famously despised human civilization and idealized the primitive stage of mankind as having been the most noble and free. The rapid rise of print media unleashed a flood of such disruptive and incendiary ideas. Exemplary, I want to quote Marquis de Sade here. That's where the word sadism comes from, a truly psychopathic individual. Imperious, choleric, irascible, extreme in everything, with a dissolute imagination, the like of which has never been seen. Atheistic to the point of fanaticism, there you have me in a nutshell, and kill me again or take me as I am, for I shall not change. Atheistic to the point of fanaticism is a great part of this quote, as that is what really happens then in the French Revolution. The Reign of Terror was an attempt to restructure, remodel all of society according to rational principles. They changed the amount of days in the week to be 10. They changed the names of the months to be aligned with agriculture. They wanted to remodel everything by science, and that's something that was intensified by the communists later on. The revolution was not a rational period where people all agreed to transition to reason and progress. Europe had already previously been on a path towards modern science and civil liberties. Leaders in France, England, or Prussia considered themselves to be enlightened monarchs. Frederick the Great of Prussia famously appointed himself the head of European Freemasonry and was a close friend of the rationalist philosopher Voltaire. Kings and queens across Europe were already not beholden to the church and were supporters of the sciences. Freemasonry, or just masonry, another common target for conspiracy theories, had long been a hotbed for so-called Enlightenment ideas. It represented a forum in which men could exchange thoughts across religious affiliations, with the major exception of Roman Catholicism. For the church, Masonry represented a prime enemy. I was told once that being a Mason for the Vatican means living in perpetual sin. A strategic alliance among Protestant forces, even sometimes permitting Jews into their ranks. Throughout the course of the Reformation, the Church had had the inherent advantage of being a single, unified institution, fighting a heterogeneous multiplicity of Protestant heresies. The intellectual front of this battle was fought by the Jesuits. Through the creation of the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits, by Ignatius de Loyola in 1540, Rome can be said to have been the first in creating a modern political organization. Jesuitism arose precisely as a reaction of the new media landscape enabled by the printing press that first allowed for the Reformation to take root in Europe. Some more perceptive church scholars understood the danger of the unrestricted dissemination of literature, and so the Society of Jesus was dispatched globally to curb the spread of heretical thoughts and repel the onslaught of Protestant ideas. Here a quote by Antonio Possevino, Il Soldato Cristiano, someone who pointed out the media landscape and the importance of it and its influence. Translated from the Italian, it says, "Furthermore, one must avoid reading, keeping, or sending elsewhere heretical books. For heretics, in order to deceive the simple, act like those who wish to poison someone by covering the toxin with a little sugar." Malachi Martin, a famous Jesuit, in his book on the Jesuits, describes that this was exactly the mission of the Jesuits, was to basically fight the media battle, fight the intellectual battle, in which the Protestants had seemed to have had some sort of inherent advantage due to them being, you could say, the carriers of the new medium, the printing press. By their education methods, their researchers, and their intellectual intrepidity, they made it possible for Roman Catholics to hold their own in the ocean of new ideas. That is something you could argue where the book, the Bible, the consistency of a text had been the media innovation that allowed Christianity and Islam to dominate over paganism, something that was inconsistent, something that would quickly dissipate and merge with local traditions. And instead, the religions of the book had a kind of inherent advantage. And the same thing repeated itself with the printing press, where Protestants, it seemed, had a sort of inherent advantage. Both the Freemasons as well as the Jesuits have been tied to the Illuminati as part of a grand conspiracy dating back to antiquity. It has been said that Masonry is an ancient practice that can be traced to the mystery schools of ancient Babylon, where astrology and black magic were used in the creation of the Temple of Solomon. Milton William Cooper was a radio host in the 90s promoting the idea of such a grand conspiracy. He reached thousands of listeners on his radio show titled The Hour of the Time, where he would go in depth into historical literature detailing the machinations of a secret elite that has been ruling and enslaving humanity since the dawn of man. The priests of the ancient mystery religions are in charge right now. We had better damn well find out, and we had better do it very quickly, for the new age is the age of Aquarius, and the exact date of the dawning of the age of Aquarius can be determined astrologically. And I'm not going to tell you what that date is, although I have it right here on a piece of paper in front of me. The new age is, in other words, the end times, the revelations. His work is titled Mystery Babylon, and we'll see this term Mystery Babylon occur again in this text. It represents Babylon the Great, the whore of Babylon in the Book of Revelations. So the secular order, the New World Order, it is the end times as prophesied. That's how he describes it. The secularized world, the worship of the intellect, is Luciferian. It is the rule of the Antichrist on earth. Is there any truth to this? On the surface, Jesuits and Masons were both enemies and pursued entirely separate goals. I would also argue that there is insufficient evidence to prove that they were both part of the same, more sinister cabal, perhaps descending from the late Templars. However, mutual infiltration as well as strategic overlap in political matters is well documented. In fact, at the time of the French Revolution, so-called conspiracy theories about groups like the Masons, Jacobites, or Illuminati were widespread, popular, and taken seriously among polite society. The Jesuit Augustin Baruel was an opponent of the revolution, and together with the English physicist John Robison, he accused the philosophers, the proponents of the vicious ideology of philosophism, of being part of a sinister plot to overthrow the traditional order of Europe. Naturally, if one reads the political pamphlets distributed by the Jacobins and similar groups, their intentions were clearly just that. Moreover, the notion that Freemasonry was often used as a means of political subversion can be exemplified by figures such as the Duke of Orléans. David Livingstone, another great writer, he's been on this channel before. I don't always agree with every connection he makes, but he's got an encyclopedic knowledge. I can recommend everyone checking out ordoapkeo.ca. He writes, "The Illuminati conspiracy behind the French Revolution was orchestrated under the watch of Louis-Philippe II, Duke of Orléans, Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France from his Palais Royal. The Amis Réunis and the Loge des Chevaliers Bienfaisants were the chief conduit of the Illuminati to foment the revolution of 1789. The Amis Réunis was a part of the Grand Orient and seems to have been among the most radical of the lodges. In his work, Proofs of a Conspiracy, Robison refers to a source detailing the discussions at the Wilhelmsbad Conference of Masonic Lodges in 1782. Interestingly enough, in the protocols of his assembly, the infiltration of Illuminist but also Jesuit elements into the lodges was acknowledged, whilst any actual connection between Masonry and the Knights Templars was emphatically denied. So a lot of Masons at the time claims to have been descendants from the Knights Templars. There's this famous book, The Temple and the Lodge by Bejent, that claims that there is a lineage. John Robinson also has written about this in his book, Born in Blood. In more popular culture, many of us may know works like the Da Vinci Code, or the theories surrounding the alleged Prieuré de Sion, the Priory of Sion, that involved the Merovingian dynasty of late ancient or early medieval France, as well as the Templars and the Masons and others, building a grand conspiracy. I would personally say a lot of these theories are far-fetched, not necessarily proven much, but what is proven and what can be proven is, let's say, telling enough and interesting enough. Moreover, the question about Jesuit elements in the in the lodges, despite them being opponents, can also be explained to a certain extent, as the Jesuits were suppressed temporarily on behest of the French king. So France was a Catholic kingdom, though the Jesuits were kind of representing a rival power structure, and so they were suppressed, and which would explain a kind of, you could say, refuge that they could take in Masonic lodges, and a resentment against the French monarchy. So you could say reactionary forces like the Jesuits, as well as revolutionary forces, both had an interest in toppling the monarchy. I'm not alleging that the Jesuits were actively involved in this. I'm just saying that you often have this kind of alignment between reactionary and revolutionary forces. After the Revolution and after the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in France, after the Vienna Congress in 1815, there was a parliament where the radical opposition to the king often came from both sides: radical royalists that wanted to abolish parliament, and radical revolutionists that wanted to abolish the monarchy. Theories about grand conspiracies involving the Masons seem to have picked up the Masons' own mythology about their order, where esoteric scholars such as the Confederate General Albert Pike are seen as having possessed arcane knowledge about the order's true origins. In other words, conspiracies about specific plots to overthrow the French monarchy were commonly believed, whilst the idea of a grand global conspiracy was only beginning to form. Quoting here from Robison's work, Proof of a Conspiracy from 1798, "Their real intention was to abolish all religion, overturn every government, and make the world a general plunder and a wreck. The leaders might rule the world with uncontrollable power." In order to dig deeper into the origins of political subversion, it is best to go back to the first modern revolution in Europe, the English Civil War, ending with the Puritan coup of 1649. Previously, Puritan members of Parliament had been engaged in spirited debates about politics and religion, while their immediate opponents were members of opposing factions such as the Episcopalians. The ultimate enemy was the Catholic Church, the arch-impostor of Christ's true church. Naturally, all kinds of political developments were attributed to nefarious Romish influence. Take, for instance, this comically long title of a treatise written by William Prynne in 1664. The title is The Quakers Unmasked and Clearly Detected to be but the spawn of Romish frogs, Jesuits and Franciscan friars sent from Rome to seduce the intoxicated, giddy-headed English nation by an information taken upon oath in the city of Bristol, January 22nd, and some evident demonstrations. With works such as Milton's Paradise Lost, Puritans were developing a unique counter-narrative to church doctrine, where Rome was Mystery Babylon. Here we have it again. William Cooper's demonic entity, described in the Book of Revelations. Here we have another work from that period, titled Antichrist Stormed, or Mystery Babylon, the great whore and great city, proved to be the present Church of Rome, wherein all objections are fully answered. So here we have the double nature of the conspiracy, which makes it contradictory to a certain extent, where on the one hand, the conspiracy is the worship of the intellect. It is the abolition of all traditional forms of society. It is the subversion and destruction of royal authority and papal authority, of the church and the monarchy. And at the same time, you've got the Puritans, which you could say were the first step into this emancipation. They were the drivers of the independent movement in the Parliament back at the time, where paradoxically the radical, zealous religious Puritans were in favor of a more freedom, more free culture, or freedom of religion, separation of church and state. As they were not capable of taking over the religion, they had to kind of make alliances and be able to just find common ground. These groups, in turn, accused Rome of being Mystery Babylon. They accused Rome of it, and seeing that we have this Jesuit and Masonic reciprocal infiltration, it becomes messy. It becomes messy whether Rome was already internally becoming the instigator of a new world, or whether Rome was basically being besieged by these new developments and new forces. The paradoxical outcome of the Reformation was the circumstance that groups like the Puritans, textbook religious fanatics, became pioneers of Enlightenment thinking. It was not easy facing off intellectually against an institution of such trained scholars as the Catholic Church. Rome had centuries to develop a deep lore and monopolize the interpretation of the Gospels and the Old Testament. In order to create a biblical vision that could rival the church in Britain and its colonies, its advocates needed to be well versed in Hebrew, as well as all kinds of previously forbidden literature. Groups like the Hartlip Circle were formed, and Christian Kabbalah made its way into Reformed Christian thinking. Here a nice symbol, the Key of Solomon. Quoting here Frances Yates again, The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age. Highly recommend Yates's works. She's written many books, but there's a trilogy where this one's a part of it, but she's also written on Renaissance, occultism, Giordano Bruno, the Rosicrucianism, and a lot of other works. The extraordinary fact is that the whole movement of Christian Kabbalah in England, ultimately an influence of Jewish mysticism as adapted to Christianity in the Renaissance, passed without the presence of Jews being acknowledged. Though there were, as we saw in an earlier chapter, undoubtedly refugees from the expulsion of 1492 from Spain in the country, new Christians, or Marranos, small in number but influential. Marranos were those that had converted to Christianity nominally, but secretly internally maintained their Jewish practice. Sometimes Marrano families could maintain this way of life for generations until they ended up in more tolerant areas in, for example, the Netherlands or the Ottoman Empire. It can be argued that despite the fact the inherent disunity of the Protestants was a weakness, the innovative character of early Reformation thought was inherently more compatible with the rapid proliferation of literature by means of the printing press. When looking at the initial attempts of the Catholic Church at curbing the rise of heretical thought, we find outdated Inquisition tactics that had worked on medieval superstitions but utterly failed in the face of sophisticated scholars like John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, Martin Luther, or John Calvin. What good was the Hexenhammer, despite its cool name, when all it provided was primitive scaremongering about witchcraft and demonic forces? Hexenhammer would mean something like the witch hammer, the hammer by which to smite witches. Heinrich Krämer, the author of it, with the original Latin title Malleus Maleficarum, also a pretty cool title, wrote in 1486, "Witches, who in this way sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box, where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn." Freaky stuff, if you ask me. The Holy See in Rome did not expect anything to be different when the Reformation showed its first signs. Or did they? Not sure, actually. Technology's disruptive potential had yet to reveal itself. Intuitively, church authorities decided to treat the early Protestants as regular heretics. An ecclesiastic critique and warning against Illuminism and enthusiasm can be found here. Illuminists, advocates of enlightenment, had already existed in medieval and early modern times. They were people that believed in the divinity of man and his ability to ascend to godhood without the need of any worldly church. This category included many groups such as the Cathars, the Valdensians, the Brethren of the Free Spirit, or the Alumbrados. Leading up to the Enlightenment, figures like Eckhard of Hohenheim or Giordano Bruno were pioneering Illuminist modes of thought. Nonetheless, there is no reason to believe that the Bavarian Illuminati of Weishaupt had any direct connection to any of these groups. Regardless, they all have something in common. Here's The Eye of Providence by Salvador Dali, one of my favorite artists. Weishaupt desired the full and ultimate liberation of man from all power structures. No more governments, no more states, no kings, no gods. He believed in the supremacy of reason and desired to use secrecy as a means to subvert the political order of Europe. He was inspired by Kant's treatise titled What is Enlightenment, where Kant makes an argument for the systematic dissemination of Enlightenment ideas by means of print media. Weishaupt and Kant emphasized the importance of secrecy when it comes to avoiding government persecution of political subversive ideas. Weishaupt is more explicit by invoking Pythagoras and a specific combination of reason, mysticism, and political influence. To understand more about Kant and the influence of new media for spreading ideas of the Enlightenment, I highly recommend the video Kant, Marx, and Media Theory on the YouTube channel Carefree Wandering by my friend Hans-Georg Möller. He's been on this channel before as well. After the French Revolution, conspiratorial narratives did not disappear, but they instead grew into more elaborate expressions of paranoia about a hidden hand steering the fate of Europe and the world. The erosion of traditional powers kept going and has been accelerating since. It was almost as if a global cult worshipping the human intellect in emulation of Lucifer's pride had been succeeding in its grand plan for secularization. The subjugation of nature and human society to the machine of rational production and scientific, or rather technocratic control has entirely replaced any kind of traditional sense of sovereign power. The last and most destructive revolution of them all was yet to come in the form of the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm following the narrative a little bit of Bertrand de Jouvenel in his work on power, where he exemplifies how division of power is illusory and power always increases and grows. Even if we have a democracy, the democracies that emerged from the revolutions had more centralized power, raised larger armies, and had more control over its population than the monarchies that existed previously. And the three examples that he uses and explores are the British Revolution, or the English Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian or the Bolshevik Revolution. I've done the same here, looking at cyclical behavior or like pattern behavior of elites and combining it with our understanding of subversion and secret societies. Here, Bolshevism should be understood in a broader sense, encompassing the mass uprisings that characterized nationalist and socialist upheavals of the industrial era. What else is Marxism but the continuation and intensification of Weishaupt's thought? Marx even descended intellectually from the same German idealist tradition, famously inverting Hegel's dialectics to serve the communist project. Now comes an interesting quote by Heidegger that were found, I think, in his black books that kind of condemned him for having been a sympathizer of the Nazis. But here he says that the form of English Bolshevism is the most dangerous. Without the annihilation of this form, modernity will prevail. So it's interesting that he refers to the English as being Bolshevists, and that mirrors something about this kind of global elite, the Anglo-American establishment, namely that they, in many ways, were instigators of the socialist revolutions, and in many ways, their ideology and their idea about the world was the originally transformational, revolutionary socialist one. It all has the same, you could say, intellectual origin. Socialism and its derivative forms, Bolshevism, National Socialism, or Fascism, so I'm kind of using the term broadly here in the way Heidegger did, were highly efficient methods of industrial development. In many ways, they came to be seen as necessary ideologies in order to assert sovereignty in a world that was increasingly dominated by a single global empire. So, for example, without Stalin, without the aggressive, violent, and murderous policies and measures by Stalin, potentially Russia wouldn't have survived. Russia would not exist as a country, maybe even today. It would have become something that would have easily been colonized and conquered by the imperial powers. For example, Japan from the east, and England and Germany from the west. So the rapid industrialization that was necessary in order to retain some kind of sovereignty, that was only enabled through this kind of dangerous but effective power of Bolshevism. In terms of effective sovereign control over the global economy and international relations, this global empire has been a matter of fact since the defeat of France in 1815. Socialism enabled countries that had fallen behind the rapid innovation of the British project to industrialize at an unprecedented pace, and at the cost of many millions of human lives. In order to avoid being subdued and becoming a mere possession of this global system. One can argue that Lenin and Stalin paid with human blood for the relative sovereignty of Russia on the global stage. Here, a very interesting quote by Lenin, given in 1920. A situation has arisen wherein 7/10 of the world's population are in a condition of servitude. These slaves are to be found throughout the world and are at the mercy of a handful of countries, Britain, France, and Japan. That is why this international system in its entirety, the order based on the Treaty of Versailles, stands on the brink of a volcano. For the enslaved 7/10 of the world's population are waiting impatiently for someone to give them a lead in a struggle which will shake all these countries. So in one sense, he predicted the volcano, the upheaval of World War II. He saw that the Treaty of Versailles was not really a peace treaty. It was a ceasefire before the war would continue. And the radical assertion of countries that had been, let's say, left behind in the imperial competition, like Germany, would prepare for someone who would lead them in the struggle. I mean, My Struggle is the title of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. So he kind of preempted the rise of a Hitler that would start a struggle against this global empire that he identified to be Jewish in character. But in this paradoxical way, until this day, especially in the Middle Eastern areas, Hitler, unlike the French and English imperialists, has a kind of a a certain kind of celebrity status, a certain kind of aura. The maritime empires of the Anglo-Americans dominated international trade and were effectively controlled by a new kind of financial elite that derived its power from colonial resource extraction. In other words, the old nobility of England simply became outcompeted by a more wealthy and influential elite that formed around the Parliament. Political decisions would gain support if they yielded profits via the various powerful companies controlling trade across the colonies. This was the true face of so-called liberal democracy, and it has grown into something even more insane since then. So, what I'm getting at here is the notion of double government as expressed by Michael Glennon. You had a previous elite, which was the nobility in England, that were controlling the land and the people there. And then you had the parliament forming as a new kind of center where parliament, in order to assert its power over the king, needed to raise a standing army, something the king opposed. A standing army, however, is very, very expensive and can only be funded if it's being used. Power disappears if it's not being used. It's like a muscle. So if the king doesn't use his executive powers in many generations, then that power essentially is gone. In the same way, the standing army was used for colonial conquest, for the kind of opening up of new markets, and the riches and the benefits, the profits that would come to the parliamentarians that would support such measures would make them so wealthy and influential that they would essentially own more land, a larger property, a larger amount of resources than much of the old nobility, much of them combined. One such example is Cecil Rhodes. With his possessions in South Africa and Rhodesia, or what is called Zimbabwe today, he had an enormous industrial, or enormous, you could say, resource extraction empire. Something that made him way wealthier than any traditional nobility that only owned land in Britain. And here, there is one of the most interesting quotes of Cecil Rhodes that kind of preempts the development of this global elite in his writing titled Confessions of Faith from 1877. He says, "In the present day, I become the member of a Masonic order. I see the wealth and power they possess, the influence they hold. Why should we not form a secret society with but one object, the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race but one empire? To forward such a scheme, what a splendid help a secret society would be. A society not openly acknowledged, but who would work in secret for such an object. Let us form the same kind of society, which should have its members in every part of the British Empire, working with one object and one idea, who should have its members placed at our universities and our schools, and should watch the English youth passing through their hands. The society should inspire and even own portions of the press, for the press rules the minds of other people." This was the beginning of a development that would later form the Roundtable Societies under Alfred Milner. Other famous representatives of this movement would be people like Lionel Curtis or Halford Mackinder. The only thing that really changed was that the center of the empire would not be Britain. It wouldn't be the United States that would be recovered. It would be the United States that would become the center. So Britain would it would be more accurate to say that Britain eventually became a part of the American empire. But it was in the beginning Anglo-Saxon nonetheless. This kind of financial elite would also invest in political movements in Europe, as they would be ideologically more aligned with a secular world order, governed by trade relationships rather than blood feuds among aristocratic families. The dying political order on the continent was hurtling towards a slow capitulation to the forces of the market and the maritime world. Within this context, the imperialist West was paradoxically the largest intentional and unintentional instigator of socialist revolutions. In fact, some of the most influential socialists and their publications would come from the United States. Anyone's left on the continent would eventually emigrate to the US, socialists and National Socialists alike, leaving behind a Europe rendered to rubble and ashes. So I'm quoting now Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug. So what I'm quoting, he was still writing under his pen name Mencius Moldbug, an essay titled Technology, Communism, and the Brown Scare. So Yarvin has now become like a controversial figure, and I don't really agree with all of it. There's a lot of things I disagree with him on. But essentially what was new to me when I was reading him was this idea that in many ways the United States is the principal communist state. That the Soviet Union was like a subsidiary. It wasn't a coincidence that it was an ally in World War II, that Roosevelt basically regarded Stalin as part of his staff, as part of his team. When the story of the 20th century is told in its proper reactionary light, international communism is anything but a grievance of which Americans may complain. Rather, it's a crime for which we have yet to repent. Since America is a communist country, the original communist country, and the most powerful and important of communist countries, the crimes of communism are our crimes. You may not personally have supported these crimes. Did you oppose them in any way? This may sound strange and unusual, but if anyone's interested, this neo-reactionary or dark enlightenment literature is all out there. The movement is more or less dead, so you can read up on it if you like to. Obviously, we need to reconsider what is meant by the word communism here. So we're not speaking strictly of adherents of Marx. Marx was one strain of communism. Similarly, it doesn't mean necessarily a central command economy like the Soviet Union. But if you look at the elites, for example, this Anglo-American establishment, sometimes referred to as the Milner, the Fabian Milner conspiracy, the alignment of central bankers, of the roundtable society types with a kind of more planned economy, more socialist planned economy ideal, and then the formation through the roundtable societies of advisory groups like the Council on Foreign Relations, or groups like the League of Nations and later the UN, that introduced a kind of system that involved the central banks, the Federal Reserve and the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, a kind of planned and maintained and managed economy by a technocratic financial system. Major benefactors of the revolutionary movements were secular or assimilationist Jews that strove to overturn the medieval order that had reinforced ostracization and a culture of suspicion against Jewish communities. This externally and internally reinforced segregation of the Jewish community had allowed the shtetl rabbis to wield a certain amount of power over their constituents. But the urbanized, educated communities of the Jewish diaspora would become especially swept up in the revolutionary fervor within Russia, Germany, and other European nations. The external support that many of them were receiving from Jewish-owned media outlets in the West, as well as Jewish financiers among the powerful banking families of Europe and the US, turned the resident Jews of Europe into targets of suspicion and paranoia. In many ways, the dominant world order that was eroding and threatening the nations of Europe, was seen as an international Jewish conspiracy. Quote, "There is no need to exaggerate the part played in the creation of Bolshevism and in the actual bringing about the Russian Revolution by these international and for the most part atheistical Jews. It is certainly a very great one. It probably outweighs all others. With the notable exception of Lenin, the majority of the leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders." Now, this is a quote not by Adolf Hitler, not by any kind of famous anti-Semite. It is a quote by Winston Churchill from his article Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. I found this quote in the work Human Smoke by Nicholson Baker, a pacifist that basically collected a lot of direct quotes and primary sources about World War II. He's not really, you can kind of tell what point he wants to make, but he's not really giving much of his own commentary. He just compiled all these sources. During these crucial times of our last century, we can observe an echo, a repetition of previous revolutions. The Puritans and their ideological descendants populated and dominated the United States for a long period. The paradoxical mixture of religious fervor and liberal or Enlightenment ideology, paired with a little occult or esoteric teachings, are replicated in the modern USA. During the first half of the 20th century, a new kind of hegemonic ideology was forming that included at once a belief in secular universalism as well as an apocalyptic or dispensationalist belief in salvation through the modern state of Israel. The witch hunt of Jewish residents on the continent was intended to root out the promulgators of erosive Bolshevism. Instead, it only contributed towards fulfilling the vision of a final and ultimate secular order with a New Jerusalem. In other words, the end times.